Chapter 4 Part 1 of The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of H.M.S. Bounty, its Cause and Consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of H.M.S. Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 4 Part 1. The Open Boat Navigation. The boat is lowered with all the haste of hate, with its light plank between thee and thy fate, her only cargo such a scant supply as promises the death their hands deny, and just enough of water and of bread to keep, some days, the dying from the dead, some cordage, canvas, sails, and lines, and twine, but treasures all to hermits of the brine were added after to the earnest prayer of those who saw no hope save sea and air, and last, that trembling vassal of the pole, the feeling compass, navigation's soul. The launch is crowded with the faithful few who wait their chief, a melancholy crew, but some remained reluctant on the deck of that proud vessel, now a moral wreck, and viewed their captain's fate with piteous eyes, while others scoffed his augured miseries, sneered at the prospect of his pigmy sail, and the slight bark so laden and so frail. Christian had intended to send away his captain and associates in the cutter, and ordered that it should be hoisted out for that purpose, which was done, a small wretched boat, that could hold but 8 or 10 men at the most, with a very small additional weight; and, what was still worse, she was so worm-eaten and decayed, especially in the bottom planks, that the probability was she would have gone down before she had proceeded a mile from the ship. In this rotten carcass of a boat, not unlike that into which Prospero and his lovely daughter were hoist, not rigged, nor tackle, sail, nor mast, the very rats instinctively had quit it, did Christian intend to cast adrift his late commander and his 18 innocent companions, or as many of them as she would stow, to find, as they inevitably must have found, a watery grave. But the remonstrances of the master, boatswain, and carpenter prevailed on him to let those unfortunate men have the launch, into which 19 persons were thrust, whose weight, together with that of the few articles they were permitted to take, brought down the boat so near to the water as to endanger her sinking with but a moderate swell of the sea, and to all human appearance in no state to survive the length of voyage they were destined to perform over the wide ocean, but which they did most miraculously survive. The first consideration of Lieutenant Bligh and his 18 unfortunate companions, on being cast adrift in their open boat, was to examine the state of their resources. The quantity of provisions which they found to have been thrown into the boat by some few kind-hearted messmates amounted to 150 pounds of bread, 16 pieces of pork, each weighing 2 pounds, 6 quarts of rum, 6 bottles of wine, with 28 gallons of water, and 4 empty barricos. Being so near to the island of Tofoa, it was resolved to seek there a supply of breadfruit and water, to preserve, if possible, the above-mentioned stock entire; but after rowing along the coast, they discovered only some cocoa-nut trees, on the top of high precipices, from which, with much danger owing to the surf, and great difficulty in climbing the cliffs, they succeeded in obtaining about 20 nuts. The second day they made excursions into the island, but without success. They met, however, with a few natives, who came down with them to the cove where the boat was lying, and others presently followed. They made inquiries after the ship, and Bligh unfortunately advised they should say that the ship had overset and sunk, and that they only were saved. The story might be innocent, but it was certainly indiscreet to put the people in possession of their defenceless situation. However, they brought in small quantities of breadfruit, plantains, and cocoa nuts, but little or no water could be procured. These supplies, scanty as they were, served to keep up the spirits of the men. They no longer, says Bligh, regarded me with those anxious looks which had constantly been directed towards me since we lost sight of the ship. Every countenance appeared to have a degree of cheerfulness, and they all seemed determined to do their best. The number of the natives having so much increased as to line the whole beach, they began knocking stones together, which was known to be the preparatory signal for an attack. With some difficulty, on account of the surf, our seamen succeeded in getting the things that were on shore into the boat, together with all the men, except John Norton, quartermaster, who was casting off the stern fast. The natives immediately rushed upon this poor man, and actually stoned him to death. A volley of stones was also discharged at the boat, and every one in it was more or less hurt. This induced the people to push out to sea with all the speed they were able to give to the launch, but to their surprise and alarm, several canoes, filled with stones, followed close after them, and renewed the attack, against which the only return the unfortunate men in the boat could make was with the stones of the assailants that lodged in her, a species of warfare in which they were very inferior to the Indians. The only expedient left was to tempt the enemy to desist from the pursuit by throwing overboard some clothes, which fortunately induced the canoes to stop and pick them up, and night coming on, they returned to the shore, leaving the party in the boat to reflect on their unhappy situation. The men now entreated their commander to take them towards home, and on being told that no hope of relief could be entertained till they reached Timor, a distance of full 1200 leagues, they all readily agreed to be content with an allowance, which, on calculation of their resources, the commander informed them would not exceed 1 ounce of bread, and 1/4 of a pint of water per day. Recommending them, therefore, in the most solemn manner, not to depart from their promise in this respect, we bore away, says Bligh, across a sea where the navigation is but little known, in a small boat 23 feet long from stem to stern, deeply laden with 18 men. I was happy, however, to see that every one seemed better satisfied with our situation than myself. It was about 8 o'clock at night on the 2nd of May, when we bore away under a reefed lug foresail, and having divided the people into watches, and got the boat into a little order, we returned thanks to God for our miraculous preservation, and in full confidence of his gracious support, I found my mind more at ease than it had been for some time past. At daybreak on the 3rd, the forlorn and almost hopeless navigators saw with alarm the sun to rise fiery and red, a sure indication of a severe gale of wind, and accordingly at 8 o'clock it blew a violent storm, and the sea ran so very high that the sail was becalmed when between the seas, and too much to have set when on the top of the sea. Yet it is stated that they could not venture to take it in, as they were in very imminent danger and distress, the sea curling over the stern of the boat, and obliging them to bail with all their might. A situation, observes the commander, more distressing has perhaps seldom been experienced. The bread, being in bags, was in the greatest danger of being spoiled by the wet, the consequence of which, if not prevented, must have been fatal, as the whole party would inevitably be starved to death if they should fortunately escape the fury of the waves. It was determined, therefore, that all superfluous clothes, with some rope and spare sails, should be thrown overboard, by which the boat was considerably lightened. The carpenter's tool chest was cleared, and the tools stowed in the bottom of the boat, and the bread secured in the chest. All the people being thoroughly wet and cold, a teaspoonful of rum was served out to each person, with a quarter of a breadfruit, which is stated to have been scarcely eatable, for dinner. Bligh having determined to preserve sacredly, and at the peril of his life, the engagement they entered into, and to make their small stock of provisions last 8 weeks, let the daily proportion be ever so small. The sea continuing to run even higher than in the morning, the fatigue of baling became very great. The boat was necessarily kept before the sea. The men were constantly wet, the night very cold, and at daylight their limbs were so benumbed that they could scarcely find the use of them. At this time a teaspoonful of rum served out to each person was found of great benefit to all. 5 small cocoa nuts were distributed for dinner, and every one was satisfied, and in the evening a few broken pieces of breadfruit were served for supper, after which prayers were performed. On the night of the 4th and morning of the 5th the gale had abated. The first step to be taken was to examine the state of the bread, a great part of which was found to be damaged and rotten, but even this was carefully preserved for use. The boat was now running among some islands, but after their reception at Tofoa they did not venture to land. On the 6th they still continued to see islands at a distance, and this day, for the first time, they hooked a fish to their great joy, but, says the commander, we were miserably disappointed by its being lost in trying to get it into the boat. In the evening each person had an ounce of the damaged bread, and a quarter of a pint of water for supper. Lieutenant Bligh observes, "It will readily be supposed our lodgings were very miserable, and confined for want of room; but he endeavoured to remedy the latter defect by putting themselves at watch and watch, so that one half always sat up, while the other lay down on the boat's bottom, or upon a chest, but with nothing to cover them except the heavens. Their limbs, he said, were dreadfully cramped, for they could not stretch them out, and the nights were so cold, and they were so constantly wet, that, after a few hours' sleep, they were scarcely able to move." At dawn of the day on the 7th, being very wet and cold, he says, "I served a spoonful of rum and a morsel of bread for breakfast." In the course of this day they passed close to some rocky isles, from which 2 large sailing canoes came swiftly after them, but in the afternoon gave over the chase. They were of the same construction as those of the Friendly Islands, and the land seen for the last 2 days was supposed to be the Fiji Islands; but being constantly wet, Bligh says, "It is with the utmost difficulty I can open a book to write, and I feel truly sensible I can do no more than point out where these lands are to be found, and give some idea of their extent." Heavy rain came on in the afternoon, when every person in the boat did his utmost to catch some water, and thus succeeded in increasing their stock to 34 gallons, besides quenching their thirst for the first time they had been able to do so since they had been at sea. But it seems an attendant consequence of the heavy rain caused them to pass the night very miserably, for being extremely wet, and having no dry things to shift or cover themselves, they experienced cold and shiverings scarcely to be conceived. On the 8th the allowance issued was an ounce and a half of pork, a teaspoonful of rum, half a pint of cocoa nut milk, and an ounce of bread. The rum, though so small in quantity, is stated to have been of the greatest service. In the afternoon they were employed in cleaning out the boat, which occupied them until sunset before they got everything dry and in order. Hitherto, Bligh says, I had issued the allowance by guess, but I now made a pair of scales with 2 cocoa nut shells, and having accidentally some pistol balls in the boat, 25 of which weighed 1 pound or 16 ounces, I adopted one of these balls as the proportion of weight that each person should receive of bread at the times I served it. I also amused all hands with describing the situations of New Guinea and New Holland, and gave them every information in my power, that in case any accident should happen to me, those who survived might have some idea of what they were about, and be able to find their way to Timor, which at present they knew nothing of more than the name, and some not even that. At night I served a quarter of a pint of water and half an ounce of bread for supper. On the morning of the 9th, a quarter of a pint of cocoa nut milk and some of the decayed bread were served for breakfast, and for dinner the kernels of 4 cocoa nuts, with the remainder of the rotten bread, which, he says, was eatable only by such distressed people as themselves. A storm of thunder and lightning gave them about 20 gallons of water. Being miserably wet and cold, I served to the people a teaspoonful of rum each, to enable them to bear with their distressing situation. The weather continued extremely bad, and the wind increased. We spent a very miserable night, without sleep, except such as could be got in the midst of rain. The following day, the 10th, brought no relief except that of its light. The sea broke over the boat so much that 2 men were kept constantly baling, and it was necessary to keep the boat before the waves for fear of its filling. The allowance now served regularly to each person was 1/25 part of a pound of bread, and a quarter of a pint of water, at 8 in the morning, at noon, and at sunset. To-day was added about half an ounce of pork for dinner, which, though any moderate person would have considered only as a mouthful, was divided into 3 or 4. The morning of the 11th did not improve. At daybreak I served to every person a teaspoonful of rum, our limbs being so much cramped that we could scarcely move them. Our situation was now extremely dangerous, the sea frequently running over our stern, which kept us baling with all our strength. At noon the sun appeared, which gave us as much pleasure as is felt when it shows itself on a winter's day in England. In the evening of the 12th it still rained hard, and we again experienced a dreadful night. At length the day came and showed a miserable set of beings, full of wants, without anything to relieve them. Some complained of great pain in their bowels, and every one of having almost lost the use of his limbs. The little sleep we got was in no way refreshing, as we were constantly covered with the sea and rain. The weather continuing, and no sun affording the least prospect of getting our clothes dried, I recommended to every one to strip and wring them through the sea water, by which means they received a warmth that, while wet with rain water, they could not have. The shipping of seas and constant baling continued, and though the men were shivering with wet and cold, the commander was under the necessity of informing them that he could no longer afford them the comfort they had derived from the teaspoonful of rum. On the 13th and 14th the stormy weather and heavy sea continued unabated, and on these days they saw distant land and passed several islands. The sight of these islands, it may well be supposed, served only to increase the misery of their situation. They were as men very little better than starving, with plenty in their view, yet to attempt procuring any relief was considered to be attended with so much danger, that the prolongation of life, even in the midst of misery, was thought preferable, while there remained hopes of being able to surmount their hardships. The whole day and night of the 15th were still rainy. The latter was dark, not a star to be seen by which the steerage could be directed, and the sea was continually breaking over the boat. On the next day, the 16th, was issued for dinner an ounce of salt pork, in addition to their miserable allowance of 1/25 part of a pound of bread. The night was again truly horrible, with storms of thunder, lightning, and rain, not a star visible, so that the steerage was quite uncertain. On the morning of the 17th, at dawn of day, I found, says the commander, every person complaining, and some of them solicited extra allowance, which I positively refused. Our situation was miserable, always wet, and suffering extreme cold in the night, without the least shelter from the weather. The little rum we had was of the greatest service. When our nights were particularly distressing, I generally served a teaspoonful or 2 to each person, and it was always joyful tidings when they heard of my intentions. The night was again a dark and dismal one. the sea constantly breaking over us, and nothing but the wind and waves to direct our steerage. It was my intention, if possible, to make the coast of New Holland to the southward of Endeavour Straits, being sensible that it was necessary to preserve such a situation as would make a southerly wind a fair one, that we might range along the reefs till an opening should be found into smooth water, and we the sooner be able to pick up some refreshments. On the 18th the rain abated, when at their commander's recommendation they all stripped and wrung their clothes through the sea water, from which, as usual, they derived much warmth and refreshment, but every one complained of violent pains in their bones. At night the heavy rain recommenced, with severe lightning, which obliged them to keep baling without intermission. The same weather continued through the 19th and 20th. The rain constant, at times a deluge, the men always baling. The commander, too, found it necessary to issue for dinner only half an ounce of pork. At dawn of day, Lieutenant Bligh states that some of his people seemed half dead, that their appearances were horrible, and I could look, says he, no way but I caught the eye of some one in distress. Extreme hunger was now too evident, but no one suffered from thirst, nor had we much inclination to drink, that desire perhaps being satisfied through the skin. The little sleep we got was in the midst of water, and we constantly awoke with severe cramps and pains in our bones. At noon the sun broke out, and revived every one. During the whole of the afternoon of the 21st we were so covered with rain and salt water that we could scarcely see. We suffered extreme cold, and every one dreaded the approach of night. Sleep, though we longed for it, afforded no comfort. For my own part, I almost lived without it. On the 22nd our situation was extremely calamitous. We were obliged to take the course of the sea, running right before it, and watching with the utmost care, as the least error in the helm would in a moment have been our destruction. It continued through the day to blow hard, and the foam of the sea kept running over our stern and quarters. The misery we suffered this night exceeded the preceding. The sea flew over us with great force, and kept us baling with horror and anxiety. At dawn of day I found every one in a most distressed condition, and I began to fear that another such night would put an end to the lives of several, who seemed no longer able to support their sufferings. I served an allowance of 2 teaspoonfuls of rum, after drinking which, and having wrung our clothes, and taken our breakfast of bread and water, we became a little refreshed. End of Chapter 4, Part 1. Chapter 4, Part 2 of The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of H.M.S. Bounty, its Cause and Consequences. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Eventful History of the Mutiny and Piratical Seizure of H.M.S. Bounty by Sir John Barrow. Chapter 4, Part 2. The Open Boat Navigation. On the evening of the 24th, the wind moderated, and the weather looked much better, which rejoiced all hands, so they ate their scanty allowance with more satisfaction than for some time past. The night also was fair, but being always wet with the sea, we suffered much from the cold. I had the pleasure to see a fine morning produce some cheerful countenances, and for the first time during the last 15 days we experienced comfort from the warmth of the sun. We stripped and hung up our clothes to dry, which were by this time become so threadbare that they could not keep out either wet or cold. In the afternoon we had many birds about us, which are never seen far from land, such as boobies and noddies. As the sea now began to run fair, and the boat shipped but little water, Lieutenant Bligh took the opportunity to examine into the state of their bread, and it was found that according to the present mode of living, there was a sufficient quantity remaining for 29 days' allowance, by which time there was every reason to expect they would be able to reach Timor. But as this was still uncertain, and it was possible that, after all, they might be obliged to go to Java, it was determined to proportion the allowance so as to make the stock hold out 6 weeks. I was apprehensive, he says, that this would be ill received, and that it would require my utmost resolution to enforce it, for, small as the quantity was which I intended to take away for our future good, yet it might appear to my people like robbing them of life, and some who were less patient than their companions I expected would very ill brook it. However, on my representing the necessity of guarding against delays that might be occasioned by contrary winds or other causes, and promising to enlarge upon the allowance as we got on, they cheerfully agreed to my proposal. It was accordingly settled that every person should receive 1/25th part of a pound of bread for breakfast, and the same quantity for dinner as usual, but that the proportion for supper should be discontinued. This arrangement left them 43 days' consumption. On the 25th, about noon, some noddies came so near to the boat that one of them was caught by hand. This bird was about the size of a small pigeon. I divided it, says Bligh, with its entrails into 18 portions, and by a well-known method at sea, of "who shall have this?" it was distributed with the allowance of bread and water for dinner, and eaten up, bones and all, with salt water for sauce. In the evening, several boobies flying very near to us, we had the good fortune to catch one of them. This bird is as large as a duck. They are the most presumptive proof of being near land of any sea-fowl we are acquainted with. I directed the bird to be killed for supper, and the blood to be given to 3 of the people who were the most distressed for want of food. The body, with the entrails, beak, and feet, I divided into 18 shares, and with the allowance of bread, which I made a merit of granting, we made a good supper compared with our usual fare. On the next day, the 26th, we caught another booby, so that Providence appeared to be relieving our wants in an extraordinary manner. The people were overjoyed at this addition to their dinner, which was distributed in the same manner as on the preceding evening, giving the blood to those who were the most in want of food. To make the bread a little savoury, most of the men frequently dipped it in salt water, but I generally broke mine into small pieces, and ate it in my allowance of water, out of a cocoa-nut shell, with a spoon, economically avoiding to take too large a piece at a time, so that I was as long at dinner as if it had been a much more plentiful meal. The weather was now serene, which, nevertheless, was not without its inconveniences, for it appears they began to feel distress of a different kind from that which they had hitherto been accustomed to suffer. The heat of the sun was now so powerful that several of the people were seized with a languor and faintness, which made life indifferent. But the little circumstance of catching 2 boobies in the evening, trifling as it may appear, had the effect of raising their spirits. The stomachs of these birds contained several flying fish and small cuttle fish, all of which were carefully saved to be divided for dinner the next day, which were accordingly divided, with their entrails and the contents of their maws, into 18 portions, and as the prize was a very valuable one, it was distributed as before, by calling out, "Who shall have this?" So that to-day, says the lieutenant, with the usual allowance of bread at breakfast and at dinner, I was happy to see that every person thought he had feasted. From the appearance of the clouds in the evening, Mr. Bligh had no doubt that they were then near the land, and the people amused themselves with conversing on the probability of what they would meet with on it. Accordingly, at 1 in the morning of the 28th, the person at the helm heard the sound of breakers. It was the Barrier Reef, which runs along the eastern coast of New Holland, through which it now became the anxious object to discover a passage. Mr. Bligh says this was now become absolutely necessary, without a moment's loss of time. The idea of getting into smooth water and finding refreshments kept up the people's spirits. The sea broke furiously over the reef in every part, Within, the water was so smooth and calm that every man already anticipated the heartfelt satisfaction he was about to receive, as soon as he should have passed the barrier. At length a break in the reef was discovered, 1/4 mile in width, and through this the boat rapidly passed with a strong stream running to the westward, and came immediately into smooth water, and all the past hardships seemed at once to be forgotten. They now returned thanks to God for his generous protection, and with much content took their miserable allowance of the 25th part of a pound of bread, and 1/4 pint of water for dinner. The coast now began to show itself very distinctly, and in the evening they landed on the sandy point of an island, when it was soon discovered there were oysters on the rocks, it being low water. The party sent out to reconnoitre returned highly rejoiced at having found plenty of oysters and fresh water. By help of a small magnifying glass a fire was made, and among the things that had been thrown into the boat was a tinder box and a piece of brimstone, so that in future they had the ready means of making fire. One of the men too had been so provident as to bring away with him from the ship a copper pot, and thus with a mixture of oysters, bread, and pork, a stew was made, of which each person received a full pint. It is remarked that the oysters grew so fast to the rocks that it was with great difficulty they could be broken off, but they at length discovered it to be the most expeditious way to open them where they were fixed. The general complaints among the people were a dizziness in the head, great weakness in the joints, and violent tenesmus, but none of them are stated to have been alarming, and notwithstanding their sufferings from cold and hunger, all of them retained marks of strength. Mr. Bligh had cautioned them not to touch any kind of berry or fruit that they might find, yet it appears they were no sooner out of sight than they began to make free with 3 different kinds that grew all over the island, eating without any reserve. The symptoms of having eaten too much began at last to frighten some of them. They fancied they were all poisoned, and regarded each other with the strongest marks of apprehension, uncertain what might be the issue of their imprudence. Fortunately the fruit proved to be wholesome and good. This day, 29th of May, being, says Lieutenant Bligh, the anniversary of the restoration of King Charles II, and the name not being inapplicable to our present situation, for we were restored to fresh life and strength, I named this Restoration Island, for I thought it probable that Captain Cook might not have taken notice of it. With oysters and palm tops stewed together, the people now made excellent meals, without consuming any of their bread. In the morning of the 30th, Mr. Bligh saw with great delight a visible alteration in the men for the better, and he sent them away to gather oysters, in order to carry a stock of them to sea, for he determined to put off again that evening. They also procured fresh water, and filled all their vessels to the amount of nearly 60 gallons. On examining the bread, it was found there still remained about 38 days' allowance. Being now ready for sea, every person was ordered to attend prayers, but just as they were embarking, about 20 naked savages made their appearance, running and hallooing, and beckoning the strangers to come to them. But as each was armed with a spear or lance, it was thought prudent to hold no communication with them. They now proceeded to the northward, having the continent on their left, and several islands and reefs on their right. On the 31st they landed on one of these islands, which was given the name of Sunday. I sent out 2 parties, says Bligh, one to the northward, and the other to the southward, to seek for supplies, and others I ordered to stay by the boat. On this occasion fatigue and weakness so far got the better of their sense of duty, that some of the people expressed their discontent at having worked harder than their companions, and declared that they would rather be without their dinner than go in search of it. One person in particular went so far as to tell me, with a mutinous look, that he was as good a man as myself. It was not possible for one to judge where this might have an end, if not stopped in time. To prevent therefore such disputes in future, I determined either to preserve my command, or die in the attempt, and seizing a cutlass, I ordered him to lay hold of another and defend himself, on which he called out that I was going to kill him, and immediately made concessions. I did not allow this to interfere further with the harmony of the boat's crew, and everything soon became quiet. On this island they obtained oysters and clams and dogfish, also a small bean, which Nelson, the botanist, pronounced to be a species of Dolichos. On the 1st of June they stopped in the midst of some sandy islands, such as are known by the name of Keys, where they procured a few clams and beans. Here Nelson was taken very ill with a violent heat in his bowels, a loss of sight, great thirst, and an inability to walk. A little wine which had carefully been saved, with some pieces of bread soaked in it, was given to him in small quantities, and he soon began to recover. The boatswain and carpenter were also ill, and complained of headache and sickness of the stomach. Others became shockingly distressed with tenesmus. In fact, there were few without complaints. A party was sent out by night to catch birds. They returned with only 12 noddies, but it is stated that had it not been for the folly and obstinacy of one of the party, who separated from the others and disturbed the birds, a great many more might have been taken. The offender was Robert Lamb, who acknowledged, when he got to Java, that he had that night eaten 9 raw birds, after he separated from his 2 companions. The birds, with a few clams, were the whole of the supplies afforded at these small islands. On the 3rd of June, after passing several keys and islands, and doubling Cape York, the north-easternmost point of New Holland, at 8 in the evening, the little boat and her brave crew once more launched into the open ocean. Miserable, says Lieutenant Bligh, as our situation was in every respect, I was secretly surprised to see that it did not appear to affect any one so strongly as myself. On the contrary, it seemed as if they had embarked on a voyage to Timor in a vessel sufficiently calculated for safety and convenience. So much confidence gave me great pleasure, and I may venture to assert that to this cause our preservation is chiefly to be attributed. I encouraged every one with hopes that 8 or 10 days would bring us to a land of safety, and after praying to God for a continuance of his most gracious protection, I served out an allowance of water for supper, and directed our course to the west-south-west. We had been just 6 days on the coast of New Holland, in the course of which we found oysters, a few clams, some birds, and water. But a benefit, probably not less than this, was that of being relieved from the fatigue of sitting constantly in the boat, and enjoying good rest at night. These advantages certainly preserved our lives, and small as the supply was, I am very sensible how much it alleviated our distresses. Before this time, nature must have sunk under the extremes of hunger and fatigue. Even in our present situation we were most deplorable objects, but the hopes of a speedy relief kept up our spirits. For my own part, incredible as it may appear, I felt neither extreme hunger nor thirst. My allowance contented me, knowing that I could have no more. In his manuscript journal he adds, "This perhaps does not permit me to be a proper judge on a story of miserable people like us being at last driven to the necessity of destroying one another for food, but if I may be allowed, I deny the fact in its greatest extent. I say I do not believe that among us such a thing could happen, but death through famine would be received in the same way as any mortal disease." On the 5th a booby was caught by the hand, the blood of which was divided among 3 of the men who were weakest, and the bird kept for the next day's dinner; and on the evening of the 6th the allowance for supper was recommenced, according to a promise made when it had been discontinued. On the 7th, after a miserably wet and cold night, nothing more could be afforded than the usual allowance for breakfast, but at dinner each person had the luxury of an ounce of dried clams, which consumed all that remained. The sea was running high and breaking over the boat the whole of this day. Mr. Ledward, the surgeon, and Lawrence Lebogue, an old hardy seaman, appeared to be giving way very fast. No other assistance could be given to them than a teaspoonful or 2 of wine, that had been carefully saved for such a melancholy occasion, which was not at all unexpected. On the 8th the weather was more moderate, and a small dolphin was caught, which gave about 2 ounces to each man. In the night it again blew strong, the boat shipped much water, and they all suffered greatly from wet and cold. The surgeon and Lebogue still continued very ill, and the only relief that could be afforded them was a small quantity of wine, and encouraging them with the hope that a very few days more, at the rate they were then sailing, would bring them to Timor. On the morning of the 10th, after a very comfortless night, there was a visible alteration for the worse, says Mr. Bligh, in many of the people, which gave me great apprehensions. An extreme weakness, swelled legs, hollow and ghastly countenances, a more than common inclination to sleep, with an apparent debility of understanding, seemed to me the melancholy presages of an approaching dissolution. The surgeon and Lebogue in particular were most miserable objects. I occasionally gave them a few teaspoonfuls of wine out of the little that remained, which greatly assisted them. The hope of being able to accomplish the voyage was our principal support. The boatswain very innocently told me that he really thought I looked worse than any in the boat. The simplicity with which he uttered such an opinion amused me, and I returned him a better compliment. On the 11th, Lieutenant Bligh announced to his wretched companions that he had no doubt that they had now passed the meridian of the eastern part of Timor, a piece of intelligence that diffused universal joy and satisfaction. Accordingly, at 3 in the morning of the following day, Timor was discovered at the distance only of 2 leagues from the shore. It is not possible for me, says this experienced navigator, to describe the pleasure which the blessing of the sight of this land diffused among us. It appeared scarcely credible to ourselves that, in an open boat, and so poorly provided, we should have been able to reach the coast of Timor in 41 days after leaving Tofoa, having in that time run, by our log, a distance of 3,618 nautical miles, and that, notwithstanding our extreme distress, no one should have perished in the voyage. On Sunday the 14th they came safely to anchor in Coupang Bay, where they were received with every mark of kindness, hospitality, and humanity. The houses of the principal people were thrown open for their reception. The poor sufferers when landed were scarcely able to walk. Their condition is described as most deplorable. The abilities of a painter could rarely perhaps have been displayed to more advantage than in the delineation of the 2 groups of figures which at this time presented themselves to each other. An indifferent spectator, if such could be found, would have been at a loss which most to admire, the eyes of famine sparkling at immediate relief, or the horror of their preservers at the sight of so many spectres, whose ghastly countenances, if the cause had been unknown, would rather have excited terror than pity. Our bodies were nothing but skin and bones, our limbs were full of sores, and we were clothed in rags. In this condition, with the tears of joy and gratitude flowing down our cheeks, the people of Timor beheld us with a mixture of horror, surprise, and pity. When, continues the commander, I reflect how providentially our lives were saved at Tofoa by the Indians delaying their attack, and that, with scarcely anything to support life, we crossed a sea of more than 1200 leagues, without shelter from the inclemency of the weather, when I reflect that in an open boat with so much stormy weather we escaped foundering, that not any of us were taken off by disease, that we had the great good fortune to pass the unfriendly natives of other countries without accident, and at last to meet with the most friendly and best of people to relieve our distresses, I say, when I reflect on all these wonderful escapes, the remembrance of such great mercies enables me to bear with resignation and cheerfulness the failure of an expedition, the success of which I had so much at heart, and which was frustrated at a time when I was congratulating myself on the fairest prospect of being able to complete it in a manner that would fully have answered the intention of his Majesty, and the humane promoters of so benevolent a plan. Having recruited their strength by a residence of 2 months among the friendly inhabitants of Coupang, they proceeded to the westward on the 20th of August in a small schooner, which was purchased and armed for the purpose, and arrived on the 1st of October in Batavia Road, where Mr. Bligh embarked in a Dutch packet, and was landed on the Isle of Wight on the 14th of March 1790. The rest of the people had passages provided for them in ships of the Dutch East India Company, then about to sail for Europe. All of them, however, did not survive to reach England. Nelson, the botanist, died at Coupang. Mr. Elphinston, master's mate, Peter Linkletter, and Thomas Hall, seaman, died at Batavia. Robert Lamb, seaman, the booby-eater, died on the passage, and Mr. Ledward, the surgeon, was left behind, and not afterwards heard of. These 6, with John Norton, who was stoned to death, left 12 of the 19 forced by the mutineers into the launch, to survive the difficulties and dangers of this unparalleled voyage, and to revisit their native country. With great truth might Bligh exclaim with the poet, "'Tis mine to tell their tale of grief, their constant peril and their scant relief, their days of danger and their nights of pain, their manly courage, even when deemed in vain, the sapping famine, rendering scarce a son known to his mother in the skeleton, the ills that lessened still their little store, and starved even hunger till he wrung no more, the varying frowns and favours of the deep, that now almost engulfs, then leaves to creep with crazy oar and shattered strength along the tide that yields reluctant to the strong, th' incessant fever of that arid thirst, which welcomes as a well the clouds that burst above their naked bones, and feels delight in the cold drenching of the stormy night, and from the outspread canvas gladly wrings a drop to moisten life's all gasping springs. The savage foe escaped, to seek again more hospitable shelter from the main. The ghastly spectres, which were doomed at last to tell as true a tale of dangers past as ever the dark annals of the deep disclosed for man to dread, or woman weep. It is impossible not fully to accord with Bligh when he says, "Thus happily ended, through the assistance of divine providence, without accident, a voyage of the most extraordinary nature that ever happened in the world, let it be taken either in its extent, duration, or the want of every necessary of life." We may go further, and say it is impossible to read this extraordinary and unparalleled voyage without bestowing the meed of unqualified praise on the able and judicious conduct of its commander, who is in every respect, as far as this extraordinary enterprise is concerned, fully entitled to rank with Parry, Franklin, and Richardson. Few men indeed were ever placed for so long a period in a more trying, distressing, and perilous situation than he was, and it may safely be pronounced that to his discreet management of the men and their scanty resources, and to his ability as a thorough seaman, 18 souls were saved from imminent and otherwise inevitable destruction. It was not alone the dangers of the sea in an open boat crowded with people that he had to combat, though they required the most consummate nautical skill to be enabled to contend successfully against them. But the unfortunate situation to which the party were exposed rendered him subject to the almost daily murmuring and caprice of people less conscious than himself of their real danger. From the experience they had acquired at Tofoa of the savage disposition of the people against the defenceless boat's crew, a lesson was learnt how little was to be trusted even to the mildest of uncivilized people when a conscious superiority was in their hands. A striking proof of this was experienced in the unprovoked attack made by those amiable people, the Otaheitans, on Captain Wallis's ship, of whose power they had formed no just conception, but having once experienced the full force of it, on no future occasion was any attempt made to repeat the attack. Lieutenant Bligh, fully aware of his own weakness, deemed it expedient, therefore, to resist all desires and temptations to land at any of those islands amongst which they passed in the course of the voyage, well knowing how little could be trusted to the forbearance of savages, unarmed and wholly defenceless as his party were. By the circumstance of being tantalized with the appearance of land, clothed with perennial verdure, whose approach was forbidden to men chilled with wet and cold and nearly perishing with hunger, was by no means the most difficult against which the commander had to struggle. It was not the least of my distresses, he observes, to be constantly assailed with the melancholy demands of my people for an increase of allowance, which it grieved me to refuse. He well knew that to reason with men reduced to the last stage of famine, yet denied the use of provisions within their reach, and with the power to seize upon them in their own hands, would be to no purpose. Something more must be done to ensure even the possibility of saving them from the effect of their own imprudence. The first thing he set about, therefore, was to ascertain the exact state of their provisions, which were found to amount to the ordinary consumption of 5 days, but which were to be spun out so as to last 50 days. This was at once distinctly stated to the men, and an agreement entered into, and a solemn promise made by all, that the settled allowance should never be deviated from, as they were made clearly to understand that on the strict observance of this agreement rested the only hope of their safety. And this was explained and made so evident to every man at the time it was concluded, that they unanimously agreed to it; and by reminding them of this compact, whenever they became clamorous for more, and showing a firm determination not to swerve from it, Lieutenant Bligh succeeded in resisting all their solicitations. The rigid adherence to the compact in doling out their miserable pittance, the constant exposure to wet, the imminent peril of being swallowed up by the ocean, their cramped and confined position, and the unceasing reflection on their miserable and melancholy situation, all these difficulties and sufferings made it not less than miraculous that this voyage, itself a miracle, should have been completed not only without the loss of a man from sickness, but with so little loss of health. With respect to the preservation of our health, says the commander, during the course of 16 days of heavy and almost continual rain, I would recommend to every one in a similar situation the method we practised of dipping their clothes in salt water, and to wring them out as often as they became soaked with rain. It was the only resource we had, and I believe was of the greatest service to us, for it felt more like a change of dry clothes than could well be imagined. We had occasion to do this so often, that at length all our clothes were wrung to pieces. But the great art of all was to divert their attention from the almost hopeless situation in which they were placed, and to prevent despondency from taking possession of their minds, and in order to assist in effecting this, some employment was devised for them. Among other things, a log line, an object of interest to all, was measured and marked, and the men were practised in counting seconds correctly, so that the distance run on each day might be ascertained with a nearer approach to accuracy than by mere guessing. These little operations afforded them a temporary amusement, and the log being daily and hourly hove, gave them also some employment, and diverted their thoughts for the moment from their melancholy situation. Then every noon, when the sun was out, or at other times before and after noon, and also at night when the stars appeared, Lieutenant Bligh never neglected to take observations for the latitude, and to work the day's work for ascertaining the ship's place. The anxiety of the people to hear how they had proceeded, what progress had been made, and whereabouts they were on the wide ocean, also contributed for the time to drive away gloomy thoughts that but too frequently would intrude themselves. These observations were rigidly attended to, and sometimes made under the most difficult circumstances, the sea breaking over the observer, and the boat pitching and rolling so much that he was obliged to be propped up while taking them. In this way, with now and then a little interrupted sleep, about 1,000 long and anxious hours were consumed in pain and peril, and a space of sea passed over equal to 4,500 miles, being at the rate of 4 1/5 miles an hour, or 100 miles a day. Lieutenant Bligh had expressed his conviction that the 6 days spent among the Coral Islands, off the coast of New Holland, were the salvation of the whole party, by the refreshing sleep they here procured, by the exercise of walking about, and above all by the nutriment derived from the oysters and clams, the beans and berries they procured while there; for that such, he says, was the exhausted condition of all on their arrival at the Barrier Reef, that a few days more at sea must have terminated the existence of many of them. This stoppage, however, had likewise been nearly productive of fatal consequences to the whole party. In fact, another mutiny was within an ace of breaking out, which, if not checked at the moment, could only, in their desperate situation, have ended in irretrievable and total destruction. Bligh mentions in his printed narrative the mutinous conduct of a person to whom he gave a cutlass to defend himself. This affair, as stated in his original manuscript journal, wears a far more serious aspect. The carpenter, Purcell, began to be insolent to a high degree, and at last told me, with a mutinous aspect, he was as good a man as I was. I did not just now see where this was to end. I therefore determined to strike a final blow at it, and either to preserve my command or die in the attempt; and taking hold of a cutlass, I ordered the rascal to take hold of another, and defend himself, when he called out that I was going to kill him, and began to make concessions. I was now only assisted by Mr. Nelson, and the master, Fryer, very deliberately called out to the boatswain to put me under arrest, and was stirring up a greater disturbance, when I declared if he interfered, when I was in the execution of my duty to preserve order and regularity, and that in consequence any tumult arose, I would certainly put him to death the first person. This had a proper effect on this man, and he now assured me that, on the contrary, I might rely on him to support my orders and directions for the future. This is the outline of a tumult that lasted about a quarter of an hour, and he adds, I was told that the master and carpenter, at the last place, were endeavouring to produce altercations, and were the principal cause of their murmuring there. This carpenter he brought to a court-martial on their arrival in England, on various charges, of which he was found guilty in part, and reprimanded. Purcell is said to be at this time in a madhouse. Chapter 4 Part 2